So, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming here today. It's been really very interesting discussing the first two sessions that took place. I introduce myself. My name is Lina Sinjab, and I'm a correspondent with the BBC, but also I'm honored to be a fellow here at Chatham House working on Syria with great colleagues. This session is going to focus on the core institutions in regime-held areas, and we'll go into the details of how these institutions, especially the military and the security, are operating in government-controlled areas. And in this session, we have two great speakers. To my left is Sam Dagher, who is a journalist and a correspondent who has covered the Middle East for over 15 years, working in different organizations like the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. But he's here today with his specialty as a specialist on Syria. He was the only non-Syrian correspondent based inside Syria between 2012 and 2014. And he just recently published a great book called Assad or Will Burn the Country, where he takes a deep look inside one family's role to and fight to control the country. For you all to know that during the break, his book is here on sale if you want to grab your own copy. And he was going to be happy to sign it as well. And Lina Al-Khatib, everyone knows Lina. She's the director of the Middle East here at Chatham House. She covered extensively the Middle East and wrote extensively on Syria in different articles. We both collaborated in co-authored a paper in 2018 about Syria's transactional state that we're going to discuss further today, looking at state institutions and the core institutions within the Syria state. So just to remind you that although this is a Chatham House conference, but it's not Chatham House rules. We are on the record in this discussion. We have live stream as well, so people can watch it online. And please, we encourage you during the whole session to tweet about the session using the hashtag CHSyria. With this, I would like to start the discussion looking at the situation today inside Syria with the regime, in regime-held areas with core institutions like the security and the military. Of course, the regime constantly talks about winning the war, about the victory that they have secured in Syria, and that they are now in their latest operations trying to recapture and retake control over all Syria. But, colleagues in sessions before talked about the other institutions that are non-state institutions and other powers inside Syria. And it was very interesting, the question that was raised about the state institutions and the government and the regime itself. So everyone agreed from colleagues who are expert on Syria that in Syria the use of the government is just a shadow, while actually the ones who are in control are the security and the military. And perhaps maybe we can start this conversation with you, Sam, to tell us a little bit about your experience. In your book, you've covered a little bit of the history about the situation, but also looked inside the institutions like the military and security, and had first-hand kind of witness of dealing with them on the ground. So perhaps we'll kick off this conversation with you.
Sure. Thank you very much to the two Linas. It's an honor to be here with you, and thank you to Chatham House for organizing this really important event on the 9th anniversary of what Syrians still call their revolution. So it's an honor to be here. So in terms of my own experiences, it was really for me like an aha moment when I just to back up a little bit. I mean, I do know, I'm of Lebanese origin. I do know Syria quite well, starting in 2005. And I traveled throughout the country from 2005 to 2011. And then, but was only able to report from the country in 2012, in the fall of 2012. Before that, like many of my colleagues, including Lina, we did some of later Lina did the reporting out of Beirut. And then there were colleagues in Turkey, obviously. But once I was in the country in October of 2000, starting in October 2012, for me, it was really an aha moment, an eye-opener, because you think that the Ministry of Information, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are more or less, I mean, we know it's a dictatorship, but that they more or less operate just like any ministries in the, let's say, just in the Arab world. I mean, we don't want to say like in the rest of the world. But for me, particularly, I mean, again, maybe that was during that period that I was in, starting October 2012 until August 2014, is how little or no power these institutions have. They are basically fronts and facades, at least at the time, for what we've been saying, what we've been talking about, the regime. And the regime being the family directly, Bashar al-Assad, his brother, his cousins, members of powerful Alawite clans, other, I mean, you can include in that the businessmen who belong to other, religious groups, the Sunni majority who are part of this regime, part of these institutions, and of course the security agencies, the what Syrians know as the mukhabarat, the four main ones, the Air Force intelligence, the military intelligence, who are on paper supposed to take their orders from the Ministry of Defense, but that's not the case. And also with the other agencies, political security and state security, Amn al-Dawli, which are on paper supposed to take their orders from the Ministry of Interior, which is not the case. So for me, it was really a revelation that the official line, the government is saying one thing about what's happening, and then you go speak to these officials, leaders, obviously, and you get to meet them in some cases, or militia leaders who were empowered by the regime at the time, and they are not shy about telling it the way it is, saying that we are the ones making the decisions and we actually tell the ministers what to do. For instance, I mean, I'll give you a couple of examples real quick. In the case of one militia leader who has been subsequently sidelined by the regime, Muhammad and Ayman Jabir. Yes. At the time, I mean, I was sitting in his hotel suite in Damascus, and he would pick up the phone and call the oil minister and deal with him as if he was one of his employees, telling him what to do and what needs to be done. That's one example. A second example, I went to interview Qadri Jamil, who was at the time Deputy Prime Minister for Economic Affairs. And before I went in to meet the minister, I was questioned by someone who presented himself as his office manager, but obviously a mukhabarat officer. And he wanted to know what I was going to ask, how much time I needed. He really just wanted to know everything. And even after I went into the office, into Qadri Jamil's office, and we closed the door, this person kept coming in to interrupt and to say, what are you talking about? This is taking too long. So there were all these interactions, and even on the ground when you're reporting from places like Homs, on the coast, in suburban Damascus, really your point of contact to be able to go into these areas, to be able to know what's going on, are really the mukhabarat officer, the army officers. Yes, on paper you're dealing with a Ministry of Information. Yes, on paper you're dealing with so-called official entities, but really they, at least then, they had zero power.
Well, even before, if you go back a little bit before the Syria uprising began, you know, there has been the form of a state. You have the parliament, you have the ministries, you have all the different institutions that should form a democratic, or a, you know, what do you call a democratic republic? So as Ibrahim was mentioning in the last session, that they even used the laws and the judicial system to show that they have everything on paper paper according to what a republic does, but actually, in fact, even in the past, pre the uprising, everyone knew that, you know, it's the decision, the upper decision are taken by the security and directly connected to the presidential palace or the core decision makers within, let's say, the regime or the family. And perhaps, Lina, you can also talk about it. This is something that we have written about in the paper. We've written about how these state the security apparatus are established, how they're interlinked together, and how they are also linked to the presidential palace to liaise and take decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just take this opportunity to say thank you to everyone who has shown up today. It's amazing to have a big crowd, despite all the, you know, concerns about health outside. I always say this at every Syria conference when people do show up. Thank you for still caring about Syria, because this crisis is still ongoing. It's far from over. And as you can see from our conversations today, things are evolving. The conflict is transforming. It is not over. The key thing for us to think about is even if the regime takes back most areas, it doesn't mean that things are going back to the status quo before 2011. And this was one of the key motivations behind the paper that I was displaying earlier that Lina and I wrote, called Syria's Transactional State, which is available on our website. And if you haven't looked at it, please do. One of the things we wrote about is how before 2011, you could describe Syria as being a shadow state, a state in which the security apparatus was very strong and in which the power in the presidential palace was controlling these different security entities by having them compete to show loyalty to the presidential circle, mainly to the president himself. What we've seen since then is a breakdown of this linear, if you like, relationship that is meant to be about showing loyalty to the top. And this is being replaced with actually competition between the different security agencies and below them security branches. So that today, the divide and rule kind of model that had existed, that was meant to coup-proof Syria, because if they are meant to compete for loyalty, then they're not going to cooperate against the president. That was the thinking. However, with the strains of the conflict, this model has transformed into, as I said, one of competition among these different security agencies. And not competition to show loyalty, but competition over power and resources, you know, with one another. And this has meant that I think with time, things have become more and more centralized when it comes to the presidential palace in terms of trying to control things on the ground. And at the same time, if you look at different areas that are controlled by the regime today, especially Damascus and the surroundings, you will see that different security branches control different areas, but sometimes a certain area can have more than one security branch present in that area, competing with one another, or at the very least, not sharing information with one another. So when you think about people who are kidnapped, for instance, someone gets kidnapped, their family might go to their local security branch to find out what happened. The security branch might not know because it's another branch that's handling it and there's no communication between the two. So it's a very different configuration of power that we are seeing in Syria today that, again, really challenges this notion of regime takes all.
Well, it's not only the competition and the division between the security branches, but because after the uprising, we have new groups that have emerged that are not per se, state-run security apparatus, but actually paramilitary that are operating under the control or the supervision of different branches, or even under the control of some of the business elite that are affiliated or defending the government, such as like Rami Makhlouf, who established supported the NDF, the National Defense Forces, who were at the beginning were known as the Shabiha and then turned into Lijan Shabiya Popular Committee, and then they became like an organized paramilitary that is operating on behalf of the government. And that had like both security, military aspect to it, in addition to an economic one, because with his Bustan organization that he had as an NGO to support the poor, actually that was the organization that was funding and supporting the NDF. And they are mainly composed of minorities. The majority were Alawites affiliated to the regime, and this is how he managed to take the control and support of the Alawite community and integrate them within the system. And throughout these 5 years, as you were mentioning, Lina, that there are different areas of power and taking resources and extortion of resources. This group, for example, NDF, had more power than many of the security apparatus. I go back, for example, to give the example of what happened in Barze in Damascus, Barze and Qaboon, where the NDF were very much active. And some of the times when there are negotiations going on between those of the local community and the security would say, we have no power because the NDF is running the show at the moment. So perhaps maybe also, Lina, you can talk a little bit about these paramilitaries, their affiliations, and where they are now based, given the different regional and international actors who are supporting different groups on the ground in Syria.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very complicated question. Let me start by saying that and this is something that came up a bit earlier, actually, today, that there are now parallel structures outside of state institutions in Syria. So again, if you think about these entities, a lot of the time they have evolved into being not just security or military entities, but are also involved in business transactions and sometimes in the delivery of services as well. And a lot of
humanitarian aid that the
UN is
I mean,
running, a lot of the time, people might think that services is one thing and security is another thing. But what we're seeing on the ground in Syria is that the original divisions of administrative areas is no longer valid. They still exist on paper, administrative regions in the country, but they have been overridden by security, if you like, divisions. Not always formal, sometimes informal, depending on the presence of different militias or different security agencies. So sometimes it's state, sometimes it's non-state, or as we like to call them here at Chatham House, hybrid actors, who basically straddle the line between state and non-state. Because we have to remember, a lot of these militias have state legitimacy. They did not all rise completely outside of the state. They have been given legitimacy by the state because, as we know, the army had lost a lot of capacity, the security services lost a lot of capacity because of the conflict, and the regime had to, in many cases, rely on cultivating these new networks to support itself. But this leads me to, to the next point, which is, okay, you have these different areas controlled by different people. Very often, the security officers who are in control of the different areas become the providers of services. And this is a way for them to also not just extract money from people, but also to exert control on the ground. And when it comes to the money aspect, I think it's very important because, for example, the Army's 4th Division has had business deals with certain key business people like Hamsho, for example, in Syria, forcing local contractors in certain cases to engage in business with Hamsho's company so that he can benefit. So you have a lot of transactional relationships that define the power relations between these different entities in Syria, whether state or non-state, or, as I said, hybrid. And that's part of the reason why, again, we called our paper the transactional state. And when it comes to the law, very often the law is also curated in a way to facilitate these different transactions. So, for example, there was a law called Law 48, which allows business people to share projects with the state and share profit. And this is not something that had existed in Syria before, and one can argue that this kind of law permits these rising profiteers to engage in business in a kind of legitimate way, to line their pockets and also support the state at the same time. So there's a lot of transactionalism going on. And when it comes to the way the people deal with this situation, because we have to remember there are people living in these areas that are being ruled by these different power relationships, in a lot of cases, people have just had to deal with them quite pragmatically, simply out of lack of other alternatives, which means that, you know, if a certain non-state actor provides you with electricity, chances are you're not going to be able as a citizen to do much about it. Of course, the regime would like to portray all this as being people in areas that the regime has taken back are just acquiescent and accepting. They're not necessarily accepting. In a lot of places, they simply have no choice. And Hayed in the morning talked about how in certain contexts, people have had to take matters into their own hands at the local community level to provide basic services, etc., for themselves. This, of course, benefits the regime in a way because it lessens the pressure. But at the same time, we are also seeing in regime-held areas instances in which people might end up raising money to support local governance structures like municipalities in return for other services to be provided by the municipalities that they can't do for themselves. And this is, you know, again, the regime will try to portray this as a sign that people are accepting of the new power actors. But as I said, the reality is people are just trying to just survive. So that's another thing that I think is very important, that all these security, etc., relationships are not necessarily accepted by the people.
Thank you, Lina. Perhaps we'll come back to you later about, you know, other factors in support of these kind of paramilitias. But I wanted you, Sam, to talk more about the differences between the military as it's operating and the different security branches. I mean, you've mentioned you had, you know, your own experiences on the ground in seeing that, but also in your book you shed light about how historically this has been also contextualized for one family to rule inside Syria. So perhaps you can talk about it, like briefly in historical context, but also today how it is operating.
Sure, absolutely. You have to remember, I mean, when Hafez al-Assad came to power in 1970, he had the support of the military. Without the support of the military, he wouldn't be able to do it. That's number one. He also had the support of the population, including you know, the Sunnis in the urban centers, Damascus, Aleppo, and elsewhere, because they were fed up with 7 years of this dogmatic rule under, you know, the Ba'ath regime that came to power in '63, and he promised them that he would ease things up. He would open up the country to its neighbors, to the world. In fact, there was a slogan at the time, and we found it in the Al-Ba'ath newspaper in the archives. They coined a slogan, and I'll say it first in Arabic and then I'll translate it. Talabna min Allahi al-madad fa arsala lana al-Assad. You know, we asked God for deliverance and he sent us Assad. So he was embraced by the merchants, by the clergy, and of course the backbone of the regime at the time was the army and the Ba'ath Party. But things changed, I would say, significantly, starting in the mid-'70s onward, when you began to have a restless population. The economy wasn't doing well. He renewed his term by another 7 years through a referendum in which he supposedly won by 99.9%. There was no chance for any political expression in the country, so people felt they were being strangled. So they came out, they protested. At the same time, you had an insurgency, a very serious insurgency by the militant arm of the Muslim Brotherhood. So he was facing all these challenges, and of course, as his son did now, he went after the peaceful protesters first. Those were the ones that were locked up, tortured first, and then in the name of fighting terrorism, he finished the job with the Hama massacre in '82. And I think at that moment then, you had a really significant change in the military and the security apparatuses. The military became much more sectarian at the time. Alawites began to be admitted to the military academy in Homs in droves. There were thousands of graduates, all Alawite cadets every year after that, from 82 onward. You have the Alawites occupy the top echelons of the army. I'm talking about ranks of colonel and above. And then the Sunnis were more or less relegated to the ranks of the junior officers, the soldiers. So you began to, and it was a way for Hafiz to say, okay, this is the only way I can protect my regime. I have to rely on my community, on the people I trust. And obviously, yes, there were mukhabarat back then, but not to the extent that we would see when Bashar came to power. The mukhabarat were revitalized under Bashar, were given new tools to monitor the population, the mukhabarat being the security agencies. And so things evolve. And then, of course, one thing we have to remember that also during the reign of Bashar, you had Iran and Hezbollah come in a very important manner starting in 2005, after the Syrians were forced out of Lebanon, and Bashar saw it as humiliation. And he himself, I mean, in his own words, saw 2006, the war that Hezbollah led against Israel, as vindication, as payback. And then starting from that moment, of course, I mean, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of Lebanon, but just the assassination of Hariri, the former prime minister, for which the regime was blamed. And at that moment, you had international sanctions. So Bashar felt that he needed Iran and Hezbollah more than ever. And at that moment, I mean, based on my own discussions with regime officials who were very close to him, to Bashar at that time, during that period, the doors were open wide for Hezbollah and Iran to come into Syria, to be, if I can use the word, embedded in the regime and the security apparatuses. So this is why you see Iran now having a different type of relationship, directly with the family, directly with members of the Assad family, directly with certain officers in the mukhabarat and in the security services. And with that relationship, almost Iran had access to Iran and Hezbollah had access to everything. And so they were there when 2011 happened and people rose up, and he had to, lean on them to fight back and crush the revolution. And even in the response, the initial response to the uprising, we all say that Hezbollah and Iran came later in 2012, 2013, at least publicly, but they were there from day one. They were coordinating and organizing even the media campaign on what to call this uprising and how to frame it as a conspiracy and how to, the narrative basically that they would present to the world. So they were involved right there and then. And even Bashar knew in 2011 that he couldn't rely on the army, that the army was practically finished, if I can use that word, because he saw what happened in Lebanon. The army was at the time, being mocked by Lebanese and later by Syrians as Jaish Abu Shahata, an army in slippers. So Bashar did know that, and he knew that in order to save his regime, he had to rely on the security services. He had to rely on members of his family, on Iran, on Hezbollah, and just finally, in terms of what happened at the beginning of the uprising, army units would be sent into places like Dara and Douma to crack down on protesters. But guess who would be leading those units going in? It would be mukhabarat officers telling soldiers and officers in the army, including in the Republican Guard, which is supposed to be an elite division of the army, instructing, you would have, like, for instance, a mukhabarat captain giving orders to a colonel in the Republican Guard and telling him, you have to shoot and kill protesters in Douma, and if you don't do it, you're going to pay a price. And in fact, I know Human Rights Watch at the time did very important work in terms of collecting stories of soldiers who witnessed executions in a lot of places, including, I mean, at the beginning in Douma, when they didn't actually obey orders of the mukhabarat officers. In some instances, you had people, executed there on the spot. And I also have testimony in my book from people in the Republican Guard saying this actually happened. The mukhabarat were giving orders, were instructing people to shoot and kill, and when they did not obey, in some instances, they were executed on the spot.
And it's very important also to note here, Sam, that there has been and still a sectarian dimension to that, because throughout many of the testimonies at this time, the front row, the front line of soldiers that were sent were mainly from the low-ranking officers in the army, and mainly from the Sunni community, and the security were behind them, giving them order to shoot, and if they failed to shoot, they were shot from the back, and this is something that has been documented throughout the uprising. But also I wanted to highlight here also that, as we mentioned, the difference between the role of the army and the role of the security, which obviously throughout the 8 years of the uprising, the security is the most dominant one. You tapped on Iran, and it's very important, and because they have been there from day one. The Russians have been also there. They didn't have boots on the ground in the beginning, but they supported the regime from day one with the several vetoes at the UN supporting them, keeping Bashar al-Assad's power, strong and valid until today. But they also had helped reshape some of the dynamics on the ground, Lina. They wanted to control Iran's role, the militia's role, and they wanted to reshape the army. If we give a little bit of the background, even in the 50s, the Russians were involved in establishing the Syrian army to start with. There were many Syrian officers who were trained and sent to Russia. So the ties are very strong between the two countries. But today, it seems that Syria's sovereign, powerful state is completely reliant on two countries, Iran and Russia. So,
yeah,
Lina.
Absolutely. I mean, a friend of mine just came back from Damascus saying how the roads are lined inside Syria from the Lebanese border, kind of towards Damascus, with Russian flags. Not all the roads, but significant enough for him to feel there is no sovereignty anymore. And I think, we all probably would agree that right now, when it comes to the most influential external actor in Syria, I think all of us would probably choose Russia. I certainly would choose Russia. I think it's very clear what's happening in Idlib now, through what's happening in Idlib, that without Russia and Iran, the regime would not have been able to even conduct this battle in the first place. That's why we're seeing significant presence for Hezbollah fighters in the northwest right now, also in southern Syria, mainly on the border with Lebanon for obvious strategic reasons. We have a lot of Hezbollah presence there. But a lot of the areas that the regime took back from rebel groups have had, for example, Russia deploy the Chechen police on the ground in places like Ghouta, in order to, in a way, prevent some of the Iran-backed groups from being there. So that's the other thing. Just because the regime relies on Russia and Iran doesn't mean that on the ground they are always, cooperating. Sometimes there's a bit of competition. I wouldn't go as far as say the competition between Russia and Iran is going to lead to any confrontation between the two inside Syria. But certainly Russia has on a number of occasions overruled economic contracts brokered between the Syrian state and Iran. As I said, the Chechen police have been deployed in areas taken back by the regime, mainly in areas that have a Sunni majority population that may not like the presence of Shia militias supported by Iran. So in a way, by deploying Chechens who happen to be Muslim Sunni, Russia is also trying to win hearts and minds, so to speak, by presenting itself as the guarantor of stability, although, of course, we all know Russia is one of the key actors that had led to instability in the first place. When it comes to the army, Russia has been curating the structure of the Syrian army to a degree, setting up the 1st Battalion and then the 5th Battalion, and also trying to influence the appointment of officers and others within the military establishment who would be loyal to Russia in key positions. And Other things are happening that Russia is involved in. In certain cases, civil servants are being replaced by Russian contractors. This is quite significant. When it comes to economic assets like phosphate mines, Russia is topping up the salaries of those guarding the phosphate mines. So we're seeing significant presence of Russia, not just in military terms, but also in these other terms that are quasi-mandate, kind of terms. This is how I would see Russia's role, of course, in addition to the politics that you mentioned.
Well, actually, but there is also an important thing to look at how Russia and Iran are looking at these two entities, whether the security or the military, because it seems that both powers, they don't have enough confidence in these two entities. They don't have enough confidence that the army is able to deliver, to conquer, to protect areas, and they don't have confidence in the same way with the security apparatus, namely because of the corruption, because of how their relationship with the locals. So even among the loyal community to the regime, we have seen constant anger against the security and against the paramilitary, because they were only interested in looting, in taking whatever they can get from areas that are where the opposition are pushed out from it. And there was even an incident when there was ISIS presence around the suburbs of Damascus, where there was an area full of loyalists of the regime, and then the word spread that ISIS has come. They all ran out of their homes, going to government-controlled front lines, only to discover that it was the security going in, looting their houses under the name of the ISIS threat, and then coming back to discover that it was all just for the sake of looting their own belongings. So this aspect also made Iran bring in their Hezbollah to start with, bring in different Shia militia from Iraq, from Yemen, from Afghanistan, from even Pakistan, and try to find the loyalists among the Assad regime to buy their loyalties and train them and control them. Same applies to the Russians when they brought in the Chechnyan police in counter of the Iranian ones. But also actually talking about that would raise a question now with the changes of dynamic, regionally today. Everyone talks about the loss of Soleimani, that is going to be a hit hard to the Iranian power and their control in the region. We've seen immediately after the killing of Soleimani, Putin visiting Damascus, walking in the streets as if sending a message to the Iranians that we are now in control, we now have the upper hand, you have no say. What do you think about that, both of you?
I mean, just very quickly, I wouldn't dismiss Iran so quickly. And I mean, the Soleimani's replacement just visited Damascus. So I wouldn't say that Iran is finished. I mean, obviously, I think Russia does have the dominant role, but I wouldn't discount Iran. I don't know if you would agree with me.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is the thing. Iran is not going away anytime soon because it has invested so much. Actually, it's invested a lot more than Russia has.
Absolutely.
And it's incurred a lot more losses, whether in terms of numbers of fighters or money. We have to remember that Russia has entered the Syrian conflict not because it wants to pay, because it wants to benefit. The economy is only a part of it. I think politically, Russia has benefited quite a bit. But Iran, on the other hand, entered this conflict. I mean, as you said, they had been there from the beginning in Syria, but they lent this full-on support to the regime.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise they would have lost leverage in the Levant. Hezbollah trains its troops partly in Syria. It receives resources through Syria to go to Lebanon. So having Syria cut off from Hezbollah would be catastrophic for Iran. So in a way, Iran had no choice but to invest at this level. And that means after all this investment, it's not going to just abandon everything and leave. Having said that, the increasing sanctions on Iran, the US maximum pressure campaign, is going, I think, in the long term, though, not in the short term, to force Iran to prioritize its involvement in the Middle East at large. And I think for Iran, were it to choose, and I actually asked this question to an Iranian diplomat a while back, saying if you had to choose, what would it be? The one that you cannot give up on. And he said Iraq, and I'm not surprised, not Syria. And to me, this means that Iran is going to work on being influential in Syria in the long term. However, we might eventually see a reduction in military presence. But soft power will continue, grassroots engagement through charities, through NGOs, through religious shrines that Iran is basically embellishing in certain cases and bringing in pilgrims and then using this as an excuse to develop areas around them with shops and accommodation, etc. All these soft power, bottom-up initiatives are going to continue because Iran has invested so much. And because the regime, ultimately, as long as this regime in power is indebted to Iran, I don't think we're going to see abandonment of Iran either on the regime's side. But definitely, in the balance of power, I would put Russia much higher than Iran in terms of who's actually the most influential actor. Now, Soleimani was also operationally important. Yes, there's been a replacement, but he was personally charismatic. He had personal networks that he could leverage. I think already, if you look at Iraq, you can see the loss of Soleimani and also the loss of Mohandes and the impact on the popular mobilization forces inside Iraq, and how right now there's still a bit of lack of clarity on how they're going to configure their power relations, especially that there's so many and diverse, and unlike Hezbollah, this is a new phenomenon in Iraq. So Soleimani did play a very important hands-on role. His loss will have had a negative impact on Iran's capacity, but as you said, it doesn't mean that's it, it's game over. We're far from game over.
With this note, perhaps we'll enlarge the conversation and have some questions from the audience and open it for discussion, please. We'll take 3 questions in a round. Please introduce yourself, make your questions short so that we'll be able to answer your questions. We'll start with you. We're just waiting for the mic, and then you, and then perhaps, yes, please.
Who's starting?
Lady here.
Okay.
Lady here, and then gentleman, and then here, please.
Thank you very much, Dina Ramadan, Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. My question is to Lina. Lina, we all know that Hafiz al-Assad is the one who engineered this security system. Could you trace any crucial transformational from the era of Hafiz al-Assad to Bashar al-Assad before the revolution and then after the revolution? And with this complicated security system, how do you see the ability of dismantling this system in case of transition government or something? Thank you very much.
My name is Vladimir. I just spoke, so I don't have to introduce myself. Question for Sam Dagger. If he recently traveled to areas still under Syrian opposition control, and what is their perception of the future of their areas, considering the fact that you see now also the regime advancing again in Idlib? So what do you think? And if you didn't recently go, just like what is your idea that the Syrian opposition has about the future of their areas now with the regime like taking over, I think, the M5?
And sorry, last question, please. Yes.
Ronan Tynan, I don't want to go over what came up this morning, but just listening to your discussions, very informed contributions about the nature of the regime, I must ask you again about because it seems to me, listening to you, that the abuse of humanitarian aid almost fuels this structure. Like Al-Bustan, for example, is one, I don't know the amounts, but I remember Annie Sparrow in Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy, one of a number of people who particularly criticised the way humanitarian aid was used by even Makhlouf, one of the richest man allegedly in Syria, and the way the security chiefs, as Lena said, in these areas would be responsible for sustenance by the people, and we know where they're getting that aid. And I just want to put it to you, one cannot almost talk about Syria now in terms of regime control without discussing the abuse of aid. Thank you.
So perhaps...
Yeah, I mean, can I ask you to answer the first question on what came before? Because again, that's actually one thing we wrote about in our paper. I think Lena's best placed to answer that one.
Well, thank you, Lena. Well, actually, it's, you know, as you said, it's Hafiz al-Assad who like designed, you know, these kind of different security apparatus in the way of like competition over power, competition on the security and protection of the state being him, being the Assad family. And the best thing that he made to gain, you know, loyalties, to bring in the Alawites from his own community, not only all the Alawites, but really from the clan of the Assad family, to be in key position and always playing the game that even within the security branch itself, there are two people reporting against each other. So he managed to have the control over all the situation. But, you know, things have changed during the son's time. So during the father, you have seen the same faces, the same names for long period of time, because he built the connection with them, he built the trust with them, and he was like the man in power, the real dictator on the chair, controlling the situation. There was a description by one Syrian opposition figure to Bashar al-Assad when he came, is the dictatorship without a dictator. And that was reflected during, you know, you see how he dealt with the institutions, especially the security. So there was always like a change of names and faces. He replaced the old guard with the new guard. And then when the uprising began and he felt that there is real threat for his power, for his reign, we've seen these changes more constant as well. And we've seen that he even brought in some of the advisors from the old guard to advise on the situation. You know, there was several networks of consultation, of advisory, and there was always confusion over who's more powerful than who's giving the advice of who. But ultimately, it was like, if we refer back to the article written by Anthony Shatid in 2012, where he had an interview with Rami Makhlouf at the time, and Rami Makhlouf was just the cousin of the president, but he was also talking about the cell of the family that meets every Tuesday to discuss what is important for the interest of the family. And we've seen that reflected in the different appointments and the different changes up until today, even with the new faces in the security, but also the new faces among the profiteers, among the warlords. You know, some people get on the sanctioned list, replace them with new faces. Some people get so powerful and give more orders and feel that they're filling big chairs. Okay, replace them, remove them. Even members of his own family. You know, Hafiz Makhlouf, who was the head of one of the most notorious also security branches, all of a sudden overnight he's just gone. So it's obvious that the young leader, the son, is not as powerful as the father, is not as confident as the father. That's why he keeps replacing people. And of course, there are, you know, the regional and international powers who are supporting him, with Iran and Russia, who also now have a say on who runs what and who is to be there. So with that note, I'll leave the other two questions for Sam.
Okay, great, thank you. I just wanted to make a quick note on the issue of sectarianism in Syria. It's important, I mean, I can't stress enough, I don't think the regime like wakes up in the morning and says, I want to be sectarian. And obviously things did not start that way at all with Hafiz. As I was saying earlier, the Ba'ath Party, the military was practically dominated by Sunnis. They were partners in the regime with Hafiz. He was compelled to resort to sectarianism when his regime was challenged, mainly by Sunnis. And in fact, the son, when he inherited power in 2000, went out of his way to patch things up, to reach out to the Sunni community. He married a Sunni. He made Sunni businessmen from Damascus, and particularly from Aleppo, his partners, you know, with stakes in the regime, saying, you are benefiting from the regime, so you want this regime to continue and to sustain itself. So I think sectarianism, the ugly head of sectarianism, constantly rears its head in times of crisis. So the fact that Iran and Hezbollah were already there, and I think that was a major driver in the sectarian narrative that emerged from the beginning, particularly among the Alawite community, saying they're going to kill you. You have to protect yourself. This is just like the 1980s. And sadly, it's also the same thing on the other side, with the opposition, when you had the involvement of Sunni militants, and also framing it as a sectarian conflict, that the other side wants to kill you. And sectarian brutality takes on a logic of its own. So I think it's important to understand that this is not like the regime's desire by any means, but definitely sees it as a fallback, as a way to protect itself. So I wanted to stress that. And also, in terms of your Vladimir's question about the opposition controlled areas, no, I haven't been recently, but I mean, in terms of what's happening in Idlib right now, I think it's effectively out of the hands of the Syrians. I mean, look at who's negotiating the ceasefire. It's now Turkey and Russia. That's it. I mean, people there are effectively, including the opposition groups, are effectively pawns. Sadly, I mean, that's what the stage that we've reached in the opposition areas. In terms of the Ronan's question about the abuse of aid. Absolutely. I mean, I'll tell you very quickly about what I witnessed myself in the suburbs of Damascus. If you remember, I would say all the suburbs of Damascus were held by the opposition, practically all of them. And each area would be under the supervision of a mukhabarat officer, an intelligence agency officer, the army, an army division, particularly like the 4th Division, in the case of Maadamiya. And these officers had dealings with, armed groups on the inside, with community leaders on the inside. And they would always propose to them what were effectively, I mean, they were called reconciliation, quote unquote, but they were surrender deals. They would tell them, you need to surrender. We're going to keep bombing you until you surrender. But if you surrender, one of the first things that we're going to give you is aid delivered by the United Nations. I mean, I've seen it in writing, and the UN was aware of that. And in fact, you could say the UN was complicit in making these in making the surrender happen, because effectively what would take place is once these areas surrendered, all of a sudden you saw the UN trucks in delivering the aid. Before that, no. And so that should tell us something. And also many instances of the aid being sold for profit by members of the security agencies to areas that were under siege. I mean, we've seen that in Douma and Maadamiya and Homs, where they would actually sell them bags of sugar that they were maybe given to them by the UN for profit.
I just want to make an advert on aid, which is that my colleague Hayat, who was speaking in the morning, wrote a paper for us on this topic called Principled Aid Distribution in Syria, which again is highly recommended for anyone who's looking for practical recommendations on what can be done to avoid aid basically going into the wrong hands. Because especially these days, the regime is trying more and more to centralize not just aid, but also NGOs, any external entities that want to work in Syria. The regime is saying you either go to the Syrian Crescent or the Syrian Trust. These are basically your two main avenues for working on the ground. And that's because it wants to be able to control the distribution of resources. But the key thing is, it's not just about the distribution of resources to its citizen loyalists. It's also to keep its network of profiteers happy. So this is another thing we need to bear in mind, that it's not just about the end users, it's also the intermediaries that are benefiting from this dynamic.
Okay, we'll have 3 more questions. Nadeem at the back, and yes, it's here. And 1 more question. Gender balance, please. Yes, the lady here.
Thank you very much. I had a question about the core of the core. And for me, an enigma that I'm still not very clear on, I'm wondering what your views on the Bashar al-Assad and who's around him. Because when we talk about Bashar, we always have this idea of almost two personalities, right? There's the image of him in front of his Apple computer, you know, very kind of technocratic. We heard it today. He has a bunch of advisors, you know, young, smart Syrian advisors advising him, do this law, do this thing, you know, and he's very soft-spoken. And then we have the ruthless Assad, not just ruthless in the way he's waged war, but also with the ease with which he seems to be changing heads of security services, right? I mean, people are being replaced. Rami Makhlouf 1 week is in, the other week is out. So, which makes us wonder, who is in this circle? I mean, Maher al-Assad, we're hearing less of him. He's a lot less visible. When we think about all the other cousins, they're not there. You know, the Tlass, I mean, Sam, you would know more than anyone else. They're out. So who's left? And is he weaker than his father? Maybe he's ending up, you know, sometimes I think he's actually stronger than his father now. And where that becomes challenging is, I've heard a lot of people say, well, the Russian plan is you keep Assad for now, and then they'll get rid of him when he's no longer useful. And this idea of potentially a new general corps, you know, new corps of generals coming up through the. So I'm curious who you think is in the inner circle, and how do you fit people like Suhail al-Hassan, you know, or other people? These, for Suhail al-Hassan heads this special forces unit called the Tiger, and there's a bit of a cult personality around him. He looks like a plastic doll for some reason. They throw him at like different front lines, and he always seems to survive. But he's, you know, it's just bizarre. You know, is there a sort of new cadre of our generals who've sort of battled hardened, you know, Syrian patons who are, you know, chomping at the bit, and that Russia is keeping in its pocket as the next regime? Or is this basically now a Assad family rule? And we should expect that Hafiz al-Assad Jr., not father, Jr., is being groomed.
That's for you, son. The second question, yes.
Hello, this is David Butter. I'm an associate fellow at Chatham House. Sadly, that was quite similar to the question that I was going to ask. But I was just going to amplify it with, perhaps I was interested in the context of the Russia and Iran and a kind of shadow war in terms of the appointments at some of the changes at the top of military intelligence in particular, and the areas where perhaps you've had Russia and Iran in a kind of shadow war of influence. But I was also wanting to throw into the mix in terms of, in the background, this idea of legitimization or normalization with Assad, which is clearly something that in the Arab world is something that a number of regimes around the region are toying with. And their point of contact, even among Europeans, I think when they go to Syria to find someone who they can sort of do business with in Syria, would be somebody like Ali Mamlouk, who've obviously gone up above the intelligence agencies from previously running them, and just as another name into the mix as to how important you see his role.
And the last question.
Hi, this is Donna from the Syrian British Council. My question is for Sam. So, after 9 years of revolution and conflict in Syria, to what extent do you think that the regime, Assad regime, succeeded in making the revolution or the conflict in Syria sectarian, like transferring the revolution into a sectarian conflict now after 9 years?
Sam.
Okay.
I'll start with you.
Sure. So the question about Nadim's question about Assad, correct?
Core of the core.
The core of the
Core
core.
of the core.
Right. Okay. The heart of darkness. The thing is, I mean, from the beginning, he was listening to everyone. I mean, he would call his friends. He had family members around him. His brother, obviously, commander of the 4th Division. People like Manaf Tlass, at least back then, 2011. People like his cousin Hafiz Makhlouf, trusted Mukhabarat officer, trusted other Republican Guard officers, generals who were close to him, friends, businessmen in Damascus who he was close to. So he was listening to a lot of different opinions. I mean, there were other people saying from the beginning, you need to compromise, you need to nip this in the bud, let's not shoot people, the way we're doing it. We could negotiate with people. And then you had people like Maher and Hafiz Makhlouf telling him, no, this is just like what your father faced in '82. And we have to kill to demonstrate to people the price of defiance, to scare people off the street. In fact, that was a position advocated by his mother, whom he listened to quite a lot in the beginning, and she passed away recently. So there were many different sources of input, but at the end of the day, he was the decision maker. He was saying, no, we have to do this. And I don't think that has changed. In fact, he has become much more in control to the point now where he can challenge someone like Rami Makhlouf and tell him, you need to pay your back taxes, otherwise I'm freezing your assets. Or to send someone like, the Ayman and Muhammad, people like Ayman and Muhammad Jabir, whom he needed so much, at the height of the war, of the conflict. In fact, I was in Muhammad Jabir's office in the coast, and he has a huge photograph of himself and Bashar standing shoulder to shoulder at the palace. So, and guess what? They are now out of the game. Their assets have been frozen. They've been neutralized. The same with all these mukhabarat chiefs who maybe got too big, for their boots. They were either killed or banished. But maybe someone like Suhail Hassan seems to be an exception because he does have that direct relationship with the Russians. And so that's maybe, I would say, the exception of the rule. But otherwise, Assad is totally in control now, more than ever. And in fact, I think we also have to keep in mind that he is still able to play off the Iranians and the Russians against each other. So if the Russians pressure him about making concessions, a new constitution, meeting with the opposition, he can lean on the Iranians and say, no, we will go in and reclaim every inch of Syria. And we've seen that. I've seen that personally throughout the years. Like there'd be negotiations in Geneva in 2016, and the Russians would be speaking about a breakthrough, and all of a sudden the regime would begin to bomb markets and schools in Idlib, and would take things to a whole different direction. So I think he is still able to do that and will continue to be able to do that until maybe the Russians decide they want someone else. But it's hard to see that at this juncture. I think he is, he has consolidated power for sure. And the question about Ali Mamlouk, maybe.
So again, there are different power play that Assad himself chooses to do. Not allowing some people to become too powerful while trying to keep control of everyone. But there are some personalities that are important to keep the balance, keep the power, but also for regional players, that they know that, in case of any big changes, they are going to play an important role, so they have to keep them. And Ali Mamlouk certainly is one of them. He's Sunni. He's someone from Medan, from Damascus. Remember in 2012 there were big protests taking place in Medan, in thousands of people, taking to the streets in central Damascus. That was really something worrying big time for the regime, and this is something that they cannot go down and like Harasta or Duma and shoot at people, because that's going to be the end of it. And it was Ali Mamlouk who managed to stop the security from using brutal tactics in this area and try to find this balance. Also, you talk to the different security and security and intelligence around the world. It's Ali Mamlouk that is the channel of communicating, finding cooperation on terrorism, cooperation on different kind of files. So he's someone that is vital, and many leaders around the world see that this is someone that they can deal with, communicate with, certainly the Russians as well. So there are some, pivotal characters within this system that, even Bashar al-Assad himself won't be able to get rid of because of their importance, but he can still control other players, other figures within the regime, even members of his own family, because the greed of power and greed of resources will make them cross the lines that he doesn't want anyone to cross it, while Ali Mamlouk is smart enough to know how to play the game and stay within the protection area that will keep him in power, I think.
Can I add something just to complicate some of what Sam said about the position of Assad? It's very true that today a lot of the functions or state operations that used to be conducted by those in outer circles, so to speak, have now shrunk to the presidential palace. So, for example, the military security committees, or the, you can call them military security committees, that basically handle security at the local level, dealing with, for example, the cases of kidnapped people, etc. These report to the presidency. When it comes to different files, whether, agriculture or local administration or reconciliation or whatever it is, the president now has a kind of advisory committee around him, with each one dedicated to a separate issue, again run by the presidential palace. In the past, these roles perhaps could have been conducted by ministries. So now you have these on top of the ministries. Everything goes back to the palace. And power is becoming more and more centralized in Assad himself. However, for me, while this may look like a consolidation for Assad, I think it actually makes him more vulnerable and more disposable. Because if you have a structure that is institutionalized, it's much more difficult to remove it and replace it with another kind of structure of different entities and people than it is to remove one person and kind of put another person in their place. This is my reading of the situation. As far as Russia is concerned, I don't think Russia's going to give up on Assad anytime soon. But were they to choose to do so, and I think, again, what's happening in Idlib, to me, underlines how difficult it is for Assad to survive without Russia and Iran. Were Russia to decide to do that, I think it would be a lot easier under the current configuration than the old configuration. And when it comes to Russia's own power on the ground, even that, despite what I said, I mean, in relative terms, yes, it is the most powerful. But even then, how many Chechen police is Russia going to deploy in Syria at the end of the day? Does it really want Russian troops to kind of be there in large numbers? Certainly not. What we saw when it comes to the northeast is that even there, the presence of the regime and Russia is amplified when it comes to the image versus the reality. So the image shows a much more extensive presence and authority than there is in reality. So, for example, and this came up in the first panel in talking about who controls what, we can clearly see that the Syrian Democratic Forces are still largely in charge in areas that the regime has entered. Someone I know was in the area recently and said that checkpoints, for example, are still mainly manned by the Syrian Democratic Forces, with perhaps one intelligence officer from the regime who's standing at the back, not even at the front. However, they raised the Syrian flag in order to say the regime is here. And the Russians are in a similar situation in that their presence there also sometimes they raise, some of the regime entities, the soldiers actually from the Syrian army who are there, raise the Russian flag in order to show that Russia has more influence than it actually has. So I think, again, what I'm trying to say is nothing is really absolute. It's all relative. In relative terms, Russia's the strongest. Assad has become a client to Russia and Iran. His position may look consolidated, but in my view, it leaves him vulnerable where there is political will to remove him. But that's another question.
Actually, also that's a question in mind also to maybe we have to look into at some point is, how much actually the security apparatus and the army today are sustainable without the presence of the Russians or the Iranians, how much they are able to really deliver control over the whole country. But we can discuss that later and hear more questions from the audience.
Question on sectarianism.
Yeah, yes,
of course.
Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, it's almost like the monster is out of the basement, so to speak. I mean, this monster of sectarianism, and it's hard to put it back into the basement after 9 years. Yes, I mean, Bashar needed to rally his community to be able to survive, needed to make Syrians afraid of one another again. I mean, it's like nothing that happened even under his father. But yes, he has emerged as effectively, or the victor now. But it's hard to put back that monster back into the basement, unfortunately, with the current system in place. I mean, you'd need to rethink the whole system, the whole of Syria, basically, to be able to deal with that issue. I wanted to just add something very quickly to my answer to Nadim's question. One person we haven't talked about is his wife. She's quite influential when it comes to a lot of the decisions.
Like was his mother as well.
Exactly. So you could say the wife, Asma al-Assad, took over the role of the mother now, because what she was able to do, I mean, since she got married to him, she worked her way up through the system, initially clashing with the mother, with the sister Bushra, but then allying herself to someone like Rami Makhlouf and the Makhloufs, and she was able to effectively construct an NGO cartel in Syria, just like Rami has his business cartel, and she hasn't gone away. I mean, during the height of the conflict, she was leading recruitment drives. You would have mothers from all of Syria come to the palace, and she would tell them that they had to send their sons to die for this regime. Effectively, that's what she was saying, and her role got bigger and bigger, and she's still there. And I think it's someone that Bashar relies on quite a bit to be able to continue.
And also groom the heir.
And groom the heir, of course.
I think we have 20 minutes left, so we can have, like, I think 2 or 3 maximum round of questions, depending on time. So we'll have 3 questions now. Yes, one here, and then one there, 2 questions, 1/3 question. James, Hayed will come back to you the round after.
Hi, Reem Salahi. I actually just wanted to ask, so you talked about the role of the mukhabarat, the intelligence, but then you sort of separately talked about the role of Russia and Iran. But what is the actual interlinkages? I mean, what's their interaction between these foreign governments that are essentially kind of in control in many ways, and the mukhabarat that's also kind of in control? Like, how do they interact with each other? Who's more in control than the other?
And the second question there, please.
My question is about foreign fighters.
Can you introduce yourself, please? Yeah.
My name is Rupert Wheelock. I was the senior British military commander in Libya in 2011. And at the time, we tracked about 1,000 Thwa after the revolution, after Gaddafi was captured and killed, as they moved up to western Syria and fought against the regime. My question is, what's happened to them now? Have they been assimilated into the regime-led state, or are they there still, or have they moved on?
Okay, and the third question.
James Robbins from the BBC. At the risk of pushing you beyond the boundaries of the remit you've set for yourselves, can I ask you to speculate a little bit about the future and about what you think will emerge eventually and on what timescale from the wreckage of this war, and where will the power lie?
Okay. Yes.
You want to start with the? I mean, I could tackle very quickly the foreign fighters. You were asking about foreign Libyans that went to Syria to fight against the regime, right? Is that?
Yes. They went back to Libya.
Yeah, yeah, they did. They went back to Libya. But when we talk about the issue of foreign fighters, I mean, foreign fighters came in on both sides, on the regime side, on the opposition side. And yes, the states that got involved on the opposition sides, countries like Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, were competing with each other for control of the opposition. And the foreign fighters were, I mean, the foreign fighters that came in, for instance, from Libya, were more the ones that had the relationship with Qatar and Turkey back in Libya. And on the regime side, the foreign fighters, I mean, Lina mentioned them earlier, came from Iran, Lebanon, Pakistan, Iraq, Afghanistan, elsewhere. So I would say foreign fighters on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to right now, as you know, the situation in Libya, there's some Syrians who have gone to fight in Libya, so there's now a reverse wave. But yeah, as Sam said, the foreign fighters on the regime side are quite significant, and they are still there. And a lot of them have not just gone to fight, but have gone to resettle inside Syria. And certainly with the Iraqi Hashd Shabi, the Popular Mobilization Forces, the brigades that have been sent to Syria are designated to Syria, so they don't go back to Iraq. It's kind of a one-way ticket. So that
same applies to the Afghani and the Pakistani there.
Yeah, absolutely. And also we have to remember that entities like Haras ad-Din also have, which is one of the jihadi groups in the northwest, has a lot of foreign fighters in its ranks. And now actually there's a division between kind of one branch of this entity that is mostly Syrian and one branch that is mostly North African. The North African tends to be a bit more rigid and more hardline, even though they're all hardline, but they're, you know, as hardline as it gets, so to speak, within this organization. Yeah, when it comes to foreign fighters, the situation is still very fluid.
And on the speculations for the future that James asked about?
This is always the most difficult question, because who knows? But I think for me, actually it's very simple. It depends on whether there is political will in the United States or not. I think this is what's gonna be the trendsetter. And I've been saying it from the very beginning of this crisis, well before it became a conflict. Were there to be political will in the US to end the conflict in Syria, I think we can see it being brought to a close. Of course, this would take time. But right now, for as long as there is no political will in the United States, all these other entities are going to be very pragmatic and take advantage of whatever opportunities they have to consolidate their power, whether soft power long-term like Iran, whether through the state institutions, which is Russia's preference. It's mainly trying to strengthen state institutions in Syria so that they can become loyal to it in the long run, or Assad himself, because he simply sees no challenger and the situation is just useful for him. Were there to be political will in the United States, I think it has to mean talking to Russia, whether I like it or not. It's the external broker in this conflict that has basically earned this position through inactivity and complacency on part of the West in general. So we have no choice in the West but to talk to Russia and find some sort of deal. Assad, in my view, can still be the easiest compromise symbolically. However, the key thing to remember is that the West has not lost all leverage. I see a lot of people saying, but there's not much we can do because what can we do now? Assad has consolidated power, the regime has won back areas, and Russia controls the show. Think about, and we'll talk about that in the last session more, think about how much Russia is trying its best to get the international community to re-grant legitimacy to the regime. This is very important. Second, how much it is trying to push for normalization that would open the door for reconstruction money to flow into the country. As I said, Russia doesn't want to pay It wants to benefit. It wants all of us basically to pay. And this means that we still have leverage. I think the moves towards justice and accountability that are happening right now, the sanctions, they are all very important. In the absence of a political process, we can do that. Standing firm on no reconstruction without political transition, I think, is hugely important because whether the regime admits it or not, they cannot actually bring Syria back to the level that it had before the war without this external money coming in, and they know that. And that's why they have, not given up on the West, because they're still trying, but that's part of the reason why they have turned to the Arab countries, mainly Gulf countries, to say, maybe we can have a deal. But we have to remember here that the Gulf countries also have good relations with the US administration currently, the Trump administration, and for as long as the Trump administration is in power, they will also not go too far in accommodating the Syrian regime. So again, the situation still gives policymakers in the West an opportunity to act, and hopefully we can have a lot more on that in the last session today, so stick around.
And just to add to Lena's point, before we go into like 3 more questions, actually, if you look at the regime-controlled areas these days, especially in Damascus and the capital, and you talk to people who not necessarily are loyal to the regime, but they never wanted to leave, and they managed to stay put until this today. They tell you what they're living today are the worst times in the 9 years of conflict, even during the time of the bombing and the shelling and the fear from mortars coming from opposition-held areas into Damascus, simply because of the terrible economic situation, because of the voids on every single level of the state structure, whether in health, whether in education, whether on the social level. There is a drainage on all levels. The community, collapsed. The social fabric collapsed. People are, they are not in the same kind of categories together. Poverty is controlling everything today. So the level of depression and the morale is really down, and that applies to almost everyone, with the exception of really the ones, not only the loyalists, but those who fought really fiercely for the regime during the time. And because of the shrinked front lines these days, except for Idlib, so the war economy, the money that was coming to feed this war has shrank as well. So the government is introducing new fines and new laws just to extract every single penny out of people. And every single day there is a new fine or a new law that will extract more money for people. So people are really on the edge of everything. So perhaps also this is a time where the West can come and say, do something, but put real pressure on the Russians, to put pressure on the regime to deliver something, so that there is a real political process that can take place, not just words that are spreading around. And with that,
I think we had a question from Reem, right?
Yes, yeah. To you.
It was about the...
Russia and the security services.
It was to Lena, actually.
Was it?
Yeah.
No. Was it? To me? Oh.
Okay, anyway.
Yeah.
So you have Mukhabarat, but then you also have Iran and Russia. So, I mean, who really, between those two kind of two bodies, who's in charge of who calls the shots?
I guess it depends.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, you have some heads of Mukhabarat agencies that answer directly to Russia. And you have others that are closer to Iran. So, I mean, is that your question?
Not really my question is not about Russia versus Iran, but Mukhabarat versus Russia/Iran. Who basically, is it the foreign entities that have more power? And ultimately, are they the ones that are calling all the shots against, are calling the majority of the shots, or did the Mukhabarat still have enough power where they're calling the shots independent of Iran and Russia?
Absolutely, the Mukhabarat, because they're the ones running the show day to day. I mean, they're the ones that summon people to be interrogated. It's not the Russians, it's not the Iranians. They're the ones who've divided Damascus into blocks, basically, with Air Force intelligence controlling one neighborhood, another agency controlling another neighborhood. They're the ones that Syrians come in contact with on a daily basis. So it's not the Russians and the Iranians for sure, with the exception of certain places. For instance, districts like Sayyidah Zainab, which has a very important Shia shrine. The inhabitants of that area, of course, come in contact with Hezbollah and the Iranians more. But for the most part, also with the exception of areas that were reclaimed by the regime through deals brokered by Russia. Daraa, we were talking about it, I think, earlier, or places like Ar-Rastan in Homs, in the Homs countryside, north of Homs. There, the Russians probably have more power. In other parts of Syria, yes. I mean, but I would say more, or even in Duma, in some cases, maybe the Russians have more contact with people. But for the most part, it is the Mukhabarat running the day-to-day show, for sure.
Although Russia has also tried, is still trying to influence the appointments in the different security agencies.
Right.
So this is
separate.
Yeah. So when it comes to the on the ground, yeah, it's definitely the security agencies. But when it comes to the higher level appointments, Russia is trying its best to kind of have influence there. But how this translates is a different story, because as I said, it's no longer the coherent, linear, let's all show loyalty to the top. So even if they appoint someone loyal to Russia at the top, it doesn't necessarily mean that when it comes to the day-to-day practices of these agencies, that it's definitely always in line with what Russia wants. But that's, as Lina said, what Russia's trying to do is kind of restore order within state institutions and minimize incidents like looting and corruption, just because it kind of wants to have an easier task of controlling Syria, not because it cares necessarily about the well-being of the Syrians.
But very, very quickly, I mean, the looting has not stopped, even with Russia present. I mean, all these areas that we're just seeing in Idlib, all the towns and villages that go back to the regime, with the help of Russia from the air, bombing these areas, and Hezbollah fighters being in the lead of the ground combat, you see looting. I mean, that's the first thing they do. Nobody's able to stop that, or maybe they don't want to stop that. I don't know. But
well, sometimes they don't want to stop it because, again, because the regime's capacity has been reduced, some soldiers are not getting paid adequate salaries, so they have no choice but to engage in looting, so to speak.
We have 4 more minutes, because I was told to stick to the time, and I will allow only for 2 questions, and very, very quick, because we have to wrap up after that. Gentleman here and here, that's it. Sorry, I'm not going to take a question from you because you spoke before, so I'll take a question from him, if you don't mind. Just to give equal opportunities, yes.
We were all surprised by the assassination of Qasem Soleimani.
Introduce yourself and quick question, please.
Yazan Dwedri from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. We were all surprised by the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. And if we were to witness another surprise by the assassination of Bashar al-Assad, just hypothetically thinking, how would this affect the current regime? And how would it affect the influence of foreign countries like Russia and Iran? Because it seems like everything is centered around this person. So if this person goes away, how would things change?
A question that was asked several times from the beginning: who will replace him? One final question, please, here.
Stephen Andrews. I'm the XDA in Beirut, now independent. One of the many questions that has always been raised has been about what will happen in the future. And in fact, it was echoed last night about the fact that Lebanon, the question was always about what is the situation, what do you think of the situation? Now, the answer in the past has been that Bashar al-Assad is a bad man and must go. Nothing can happen until once he's gone.
Can we make the question quick, please, and short?
Because we only have 2 minutes.
Yes.
Particularly seeing as we're talking about the regime elements, do we now accept that actually Bashar al-Assad is not going and that we have to work with a policy that accepts that he is going to be there?
Okay, thank you. Lina and Sam, you have 2 minutes.
Okay. My prediction is he's not going to be there as long as he thinks, so let's not bet on him staying. It's not game over. It's not game over. I think right now in the US, the approach to Syria has become a component of the larger approach to Iran, and that is not going to stop anytime soon. And Assad is part of that. I think it's just being articulated differently. Just because the US no longer talks about regime change doesn't mean that they have accepted Assad and the rest of the world should do the same or will do the same. So we have to be a bit careful about saying, we'll just have to live with this.
Sam?
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment that kind of tries to tie all of these things together. One thing we've completely ignored so far in our discussion about the future and whether Bashar stays or goes are the Syrian people themselves. There are about 7 million Syrians scattered all over the world. You're talking about 1/3 of the population, just imagine, out of the country, most of them against the regime, and many of them trying to hold the regime accountable for its war crimes. They haven't given up. So that wasn't the case under his father at all. You didn't have that. So I think we must keep that in mind. Number two, with the protests in Lebanon starting in mid-October, guess what? Syrians were watching that, and there were attempts at protests in several places, including Suwaida, and I mean mainly Suwaida in the south, which is dominated by the Druze minority. There were attempts to protest in Salamiye, but people were at the end too scared. They're trying to coordinate protests in Tartus and Daraa. So people have not given up on the dream of getting rid of this regime. So I think in any solution that we talk about for Syria, and whether Bashar can stay or go, and whether we should deal with him, we have to put the Syrian people front and center in this, because they're the ones, you know, are concerned with this. And I don't think we do that enough. Yeah. And I think what Brahim said earlier, Brahim Alabi said earlier. I mean, the map that we look at with the colors of military control. There's another map which is the allegiance map. Guess what? I mean, most of the people in regime-controlled areas are against the regime.
And with that note, also we have to remember that, you know, even among loyalists today, you have to look at the anger among the loyalists. That, you know, the image of the leadership is not the same. He's not someone that he is feared and respected. They're only affiliated to him because of the fear of the future and what's going to happen next. With that note, I wanted to say thank you very much for attending. We have 30 minutes of a break. Sam's book is here if you want a copy of it. And please stick around for the next and the final session, because it's going to be an amazing session, because there are 3 amazing Syrian women, Syrian female experts speaking to you about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.